AV folks are giving me the thumbs up.
Say Happy New Year.
Julie tells me to say Happy New Year to everyone. First thing I'd like to do that's not on our agenda is recognize our new member, Bill Holloman. He is the new appointee from the City Commission. He has his own law firm here in Tallahassee. He is a registered patent attorney and previously has served on the Elections Commission, so he is familiar with generally the kind of activity that we engage in. And I'd like to recognize Mr. Holloman to say whatever he'd like to say.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to serve with you and the other board members, and I look forward to doing what we can to make sure that the city and lives up to the promise that it has.
Thank you, sir. The first item technically on our agenda is the approval of the minutes from our last meeting on December 19th. 2017. Does anyone have any comments, corrections, or edits? Seeing none, Mr. Smith moves the approval of the minutes, and Ms. McNeil seconds. I'm getting nods. That's a good thing. All in favor say aye. 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 Opposed, nay. The minutes are approved. Next is the Ethics Officer report, and as we always do, there are a number of items. We will go through these individually. Ms. Meadows-Keefe will talk about them, and then we'll take questions at the end of each of the, I think there's about 6 items. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The first item is the monthly Ethics Officer report. And you will see the various activities that I conducted and participated in during the month prior to this meeting. Notably, there was a special City Commission meeting on some important staff issues, and there was a City Commission retreat. And also have been busy this month preparing for ethics education for the city leadership team that will occur tomorrow. So we've got several hours scheduled with the leadership team to do some education. And also went to a Kiwanis meeting at 7 a.m. in Killarn. From Southwood. So it was great to see gentlemen up at that hour interested in hearing what the board is doing, and it's always a pleasure to talk about the board activities. So that completes that report.
Okay, any questions about Ms. Meadows-Keefe's activities? I will note on the ethics education for tomorrow, one of the things that will be handed out is on our agenda later, and that is related to gifts. And during tomorrow's education, there will be a specific presentation on gifts for both people who are Form 1 filers and people who are procurement employees. So we'll be going over that. That's an issue that's we've heard a fair amount about in public testimony, so we'll be going over that in both written and verbal detail and make sure that that everyone's clear on where they ought to be. So hopefully we will have addressed that issue as much as we can within our current jurisdiction. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're on the hotline tracking monthly report, and we will go through these one at a time for Mr. Holloman's benefit. On the complaints, what we do, anything that's on the sheet, Ms. Meadows-Keefe makes a recommendation, and then the board makes the final decision, so we can follow her recommendation or not, and we'll do those one by one. We'll just tick down through the list. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
And just hearkening back to the last item about the ethics education tomorrow, the chair is going to be talking to the employees about gifts. So he won't toot his own horn, but I will. The Independent Ethics Board Hotline Tracking Monthly Report for January 2018. Starting with number 117, I'm just going to update you all that the audit concerning the P cards continues, and they're working diligently on trying to complete that. I know that because I work across the hall from the lady that's handling that, and she's in there with the door closed. So I will report back when that is complete. Moving to complaint number 118. This was a carryover from last month, and various allegations that city officials were utilizing city employees to undertake various services at their private residences. And I had recommended in December that those allegations, those complaints be closed because they were prior to board's inception and current ethics code. The board asked that I reach out to make a referral potentially of those allegations to an appropriate authority. In this case, I did call and speak personally with Mr. Campbell, and he was aware of all of those allegations, and he said that those had been referred to FDLE. So it is my recommendation at this point to basically repeat the recommendation that it be closed.
Okay, does anybody have any comments?
Yeah, just a comment, Mr. Chair. So after FDLE concludes their investigation, do the complainants get knowledge of that? How's that work?
Actually, I have to, you do get feedback. Okay, so I see an individual who I think made the complaints at the last meeting, and he's nodding agreement that they are told. I don't know if they always make public reports.
It'll be made public.
Okay.
I'll come in here and give you a presentation.
Okay.
I would note that if our jurisdiction is expanded to cover misuse of position, that anything like this that occurs in the future would be within the jurisdiction of this board. Also, it is conceivable that certainly this is something we'll talk about tomorrow with city employees concerning gifts, because this could also be perceived as a gift that you have received, even if it's not misuse of position. So.
My point, Mr. Chair, is just that whoever the complainant is, in this case, I guess we know, but if we don't, that's the kind of person that would like to have someone ensure there's follow-up so that that person knows, aha, somebody actually took this seriously and it got referred, but it was closed for whatever, or there's follow-up to it, so that person knows that it just didn't go into a hole someplace.
Right. In terms of what we can do, the only thing we could do would be to leave this pending and attempt to report on it at a few. Again, many of our complaints, this one would not be, but many of our complaints are anonymous. Since this one's not, I wouldn't think we would need to do that, but where it's an anonymous complaint, we might need to leave it pending so that we could simply announce, and whoever made the complaint could listen to our meeting for some result. Anything else? Does anybody object to closing this? Okay, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, 122.
Okay, this one is also, I'm sorry, a follow-up of an item from last month where there's an allegation that city staff accepted gifts exceeding $100. 2 of 3 were reporting individuals and didn't report the gift. And as per board bylaws, those allegations were reported to supervisory staff over those 2 employees. And as of today, that matter itself is still pending. There has not been a decision made yet about what to do about that particular matter. It has not been closed. They're still trying to determine what action would be appropriate. So my recommendation is that I report back to you next month, and hopefully by then there will be final resolution to that.
Questions? I just have one question, and I should know the answer. I don't remember the timing. Were these gifts made or accepted after the creation of this board?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. So 122 is pending.
Yep.
Number 124.
Okay, number 124 was actually a new one for this month, and this was an example of those calls that I get that are sometimes random, probably generated from Google searches. This person lived in Montreal, Canada, and he said that he was inappropriately and unfairly tried for assault of his infant son in St. Johns County in 1991. And he sent me a parcel of documents and YouTube videos, and obviously this is, well, not obviously, in my opinion, this is not within the jurisdiction of this board, and I recommend the matter be closed.
Comments? Anybody object to closing it? Okay, we'll go on to 125.
125 deals with a complainant who's been before this board in the past related to being barred from a particular facility, not city-owned, in the city of Tallahassee. And I apprised the board of this at a prior meeting. It was closed, and the complainant called me to indicate that he was dissatisfied with my explanation to the board, and that he wanted me to share with you that he and one other woman were also barred, and that ostensibly they could be denied health care services if needed. So he wanted that to be shared. And so I'm sharing that. I don't recommend that we do anything other than keep it closed. So that is my recommendation.
Okay, anybody object to that recommendation? Seeing none. Number 126.
Okay, finally, number 126, there was a call from a retiree from the city stating that there was an inappropriate amount withheld from their pension payment, I think for benefits. So I reached out to the treasurer clerk, who looked into it, corrected the future withholding, and communicated with the retiree. So that action basically resolved the concern, so I have recommended closure of that matter.
Any comments, questions? Did you, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, learn anything that would lead you to believe that this is a recurring problem, or was this just a one-time situation as far as you know?
I believe it was an anomaly.
Okay. Seeing no objection to closing that, we would go on to the next item, which is our, we talked about this last month. This is the first one of these we've seen, although Ms. Meadows-Keefe has been monitoring public records requests made by third parties to the city. So we'll start seeing these on a regular basis. These, the idea of this is that there might be something in one of these public records requests that some smart person or some knowledgeable person has seen and is looking for something that some member of the board may also want to pursue. So it was an opportunity for us to be a little bit proactive in seeking issues rather than just waiting for people to file complaints with us.
So unless there's questions, I'm not necessarily going to go through all of these, but you'll note there are several from various reporters. One individual is a former employee, and then another individual is well known to this board.
We'll take a couple minutes here. I want to take another look through this list. Again, I think there are some of these, assuming that our jurisdiction is expanded, there may be some where we would come in and ask for a copy of the city's response, because there might be some things that in the future that would fall pretty directly within our jurisdiction. There's a couple in here that kind of jump out at me as things that this board might want to look at under an expanded jurisdiction.
Ready to go on to the next?
Mr. Currington.
Mr. Chair, I'm hopefully not the only one that's curious, but there are large gaps in the numbers. If Julie could explain why we skip over numbers in the complaints?
Oh, and the request number?
Right.
Do you know that, Ms. Meadows?
These may not capture public records requests that are made independent of the normal route, which is make a public records request through the treasurer clerk's office, who's the records custodian. These may not capture the requests that may be made like over the phone. Hey, can you send these over? So this report actually may not be capturing all those.
Okay, so can you, next month, can you fill us in on the detail?
Yeah.
Or it might be that there are duplicate requests. I can imagine a number of things, but you're right, Mr. Currington, it would be good to know what we're not seeing, since this is supposed to help us. Okay, moving on to the next item is our monthly budget report. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, if you're recognized.
Okay. I wouldn't say there's anything that is unusual about this particular month. So unless there are questions.
Okay. Ms. McNeil's not jumping up and down. I count on her to tell me if there's something there I need to worry about. So we'll move on. The next item on the agenda is, oh, I'm sorry, the proposed judgment.
Yes.
We're still on item 3.
Well, we are, this is basically some of the things that I am sharing with the board during my reporting time will be documents that are of interest and that will also provide some kind of closure or information on issues the board may have been monitoring through the news clips that I send. So you will recall that there was a lawsuit against the city brought by the Democrat, and over the holiday there was a settlement achieved in this related to text messaging, and so there was a resolution of all of that, and the city will be taking remedial measures to attempt to capture future public records more diligently than in the past. The Democrat was awarded attorney's fees pursuant to Section 119 that they will pay. And there's also a stipulation there in parentheses F, and actually we're going to have a further agenda item on this later on about more things the city's doing, but the parties agreed that the plaintiff, through a lawyer, can conduct interviews with various members of city staff to talk about the implementation of new public records policies and how the city is going about improving compliance with public records law. And then the court retained jurisdiction over the matter to monitor compliance, and there's going to be a status conference in September. So that is how that resolved. And then as an attachment to that, there are some things that the city's agreed to do in order to resolve the case. So one thing I'll say, kind of not jumping ahead in the agenda, but there's going to be additional training taking place, and part of that is tomorrow. There's going to be 2 parts to the education tomorrow that are going to touch on these things. And also, the city has invested around $100,000 in technology that's going to capture text messages, so they cannot be deleted. So that's an issue that had come up before that they've remedied. So I did want to, and you'll see here I'm tasked with annual training to the city leadership team and elected officials. So I'll be responsible for conducting a lot of that.
Okay.
So that's just an update for the board.
Any comments? I do have one question, Ms. Meadows-Keefe. After the last hurricane, we saw a lot of folks from other jurisdictions under our mutual aid agreements in here, and I think City of Tallahassee residents got their electricity back in record order. I think I was in the last 1/10 of 1%, and I was on about day 3. So huge improvement over what we've seen previously. But when you have that number of people who may not even be from Florida, may not know what a public record, the distinction about public records, and you have to communicate with them, has there been thought to how, in this, as far as you know, to how all of that's going to work in that, not that specific situation, but that type of situation?
I don't know all of the ramifications of this and how they'll be communicated, but what I will say is that in the past, some city officials may have used their own personal phones, say for texting, and for other, like sending a Gmail or whatever. So there's been a change in the policy that you're supposed to use your city phone for your city business, and some people were trying to be diligent, I guess, in not incurring that expense for the city and just using their personal device. But of course, that device will not be equipped with the text deletion enhancement. So one example of how they're trying to deal with it is telling folks, hey, please use your city phone for city business and refrain from using your personal device. How you control for situations like what you're describing, I'm not sure you can, because linemen and more rank and file employees don't generally have those
Right,
city phones.
But it may be critical to life and safety that they communicate with each other. And so
Right.
you may have 2 guys, 2 persons, I'm sure there are female line persons, I'm not sure what the right word is, two electrical workers from a city in Mississippi who are here in Tallahassee communicating with each other via their personal cell phones. And it's curious. I am curious about it, so maybe we can ask tomorrow when we do training.
That's interesting, yeah. Okay.
And the next item, the last item in number 3, and then I'm going to recognize Mr. Wilcox.
Okay. The final item is just the thank you I got from the Kiwanis Club. Actually, I have 2 more items in this report, but they did appreciate the educational role of the board's mission, and I'm going to be trying to do that more and more this year with public outreach and education, especially about our ethics and fraud hotline, and trying to get more folks to utilize that so we get more information about what folks are concerned about. And finally, for the board's information, I think I did hopefully enclose, or maybe you didn't get the agenda for tomorrow, or I'm just updating you all on what the agenda is for tomorrow's ethics education. They're going to talk about the general records retention schedule and its applicability to electronic messages. We're going to talk about public records update with Pat Gleason. We're going to talk about the appearance of impropriety with Simone Marstiller, and you'll recall she came to address you all probably last year. And then our chair is going to talk about reporting gifts, and then we're going to have a reporter from the Tallahassee Democrat come and talk about the role of public records in journalism. And then finally, I'm going to talk to the leadership about what happened in 2017 and what we anticipate for this year. So that will be going on tomorrow.
All right.
Mr. Chair, is that going on right here in the city?
It is.
In this room?
It will be going on in this room. It is an internal, it's a leadership team meeting. So there will be a reporter presenting, but it has not been noticed because it's basically a leadership team meeting that's a training.
Okay. Mr. Wilcox, you're recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and board members. I just wanted to, we talked a little bit about this at your last meeting, but just wanted to revisit case number 122 on the Ethics Board hotline tracking sheet. And this is the case where the citizen alleges 3 city staff accepted gifts exceeding $100. 2 of the 3 were reporting individuals and did not report the gift. And then the action taken was to refer it to the acting city manager, and that is per the board's bylaws. And I just question that action because if this is involving the football tickets that were given to the city manager at the time, and then the city manager supposedly gave them to city employees, I just question referring it to the acting city manager when at the time the referral was made, the city manager was still employed. And I just don't think it does justice to the original complaint. And I think there should have been an investigation by this board. And then after the investigation, if you find that this allegation is accurate, then maybe, if you determine you don't have jurisdiction over this, it seems like it should be referred maybe to the Florida Commission on Ethics. And that would be a case where, you would use your referral power to do that, or refer it to the state attorney and ask the state attorney to refer it to the Florida Commission on Ethics. So that's all. I just question that referral on that item.
Okay, and Mr. Wilcox, I can tell you, I agree with you 100%, and Julie and I have been working on some language for our bylaws when we have situations where kicking it up the corporate ladder, so to speak, it produces a silly result. In some cases, you run out of people internally to refer it to, which I think leads us back to the Florida Commission on Ethics as a possibility. We have continued to look at that, and Julie and I are having some discussions about how we can follow up on it. Some of it is we're going to hit hard in the training tomorrow, that specific issue. I know I have a part of my presentation is specifically on tickets. So, and I believe that the people in question, I know at least one of them, I think all of them are there. But I won't know till I get in the room. But we haven't lost sight of that issue.
Okay, good. It just seems like it's more of an action taken by a staff member of the city rather than the independent ethics officers.
Right. I'm going to very quickly skip over item 4 and go to item 5, public comment, rather than make you wait till the bitter end, and recognize Dr. Jackson. I think technically you'd be item 12, but we're not that tight.
Very good. New year. Glad to be here. Glad to see everyone here. I want to welcome William Holloman, and I want to personally thank him for agreeing to volunteer your time to serve on this board, to serve the city on a board. Unfortunately, I believe you're serving on this board creates a problem. And this is supposed to be an independent ethics board. Your being here, I think, raises at least the appearance of a conflict of interest. I was going to call and speak to you privately, but I always think it's better to deal with these issues in the public. The City Commission has fought the citizens every step of the way, trying to prevent us from having an independent ethics board. The City Commission has used Attorney Shelley to exclude city commissioners who use their position for their personal financial gain. That wasn't unethical, according to City Attorney Shelley. Most significant penalties were eliminated. And only a few weeks ago, Scott Maddox requested the board must now determine, I think it was criminal intent, making it so much more difficult to find anything impossible, find anything wrong, almost impossible. The fact that the Owsley law firm is a city contractor, and because you're a member of the Owsley family, your independence on all issues dealing with city contractors would be questioned by many in the community. I also believe that having an attorney from the Owsley law firm representing, giving legal counsel to this board gives another appearance of a conflict. Hiring a city contractor to serve as an attorney for this ethics board, and we're now accepting a family member of the Owsley law firm, Owsley family, to serve on a supposedly independent board, further erodes the confidence of this board. I think there's a number of boards you could serve on, and we'd be thankful to have you there. This, though, I think we shouldn't have an attorney or a board member who's either working for or has close ties with city contractors. We can certainly find an attorney that's not a city contractor of the city to be on our board. There's plenty of people, I think, that would be more than happy to serve on the ethics board that has no relationship with a substantial city contractor. I would strongly urge you review your thoughts in this matter. The most important thing you could do, I believe, to strengthen this board is to contact the City Commission and refuse the appointment. There's nothing you can do to fix the problem. You will always be questioned, and I don't think we need any more questioning of leadership in the city of Tallahassee. There's plenty of that going on right now. I do look forward to your thoughts. On a second note, real quick, the USA Today had a little article. They talked about the embezzlement. It was written by a guy who's a former federal prosecutor and a law professor at Wayne State University. Now, what was interesting, he found that in unions of the last year, over 300 unions were found people stealing from the unions. All right, lots of theft going on. And his conclusion, though, was unions are not unique. Wherever there's money, there'll be theft. He then says, and I quote, "You can't train people to be ethical. It's just access to money." So when I sit out here and I hear we're going to have these training programs and these training programs and those training programs, the bottom line, you can't train ethics. If a guy is going to steal, they're going to steal. We don't need more education. We need more investigation and enforcement. My understanding is, and Rick Fernandez lied to the Florida Ethics Commission under oath. If he did, that is a felony. If that is true, we have an ordinance in the city that says if you're found guilty of a felony, you lose your retirement benefit, and that's backed up by state law. So when they respond to my ethics complaint, and if that is proven, if you want to get the word across to 3,000 city employees, here's Fernandez, and he lost his 30 years of retirement income because he took more than his check. It's simple. you take, every 2 weeks, you get a check in the mail. If you get anything else other than that check every 2 weeks, you may wind up like Fernandez. That'll send the message. We don't have to hire trainers. Believe me, people understand it. And thank you, sir. I appreciate your consideration and comments.
Any questions?
Mr. Chairman, may I respond? Thank you. Dr. Jackson, I want you to know that in agreeing to accept this position, I carefully considered the exact issues that you raised in your presentation today, and I thought through them, I believe, very carefully and thoughtfully, and I came to the conclusion that I believe that I could, without conflict and in a fair and unbiased way, participate as a member of this board. And I just ask that you judge me by my performance, and let's see how this goes.
Okay, since I've jumped to 5, any other public comment? All right, and you all know if something comes up, all you can do is jump up and I'll recognize you. So now I'm going to go back to 4 on pre-existing violations. And this is going to be Mr. Currington.
It's the ethics moment by Mr. Currington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've done a memo to the board or to the chair, which has been distributed. I'm going to try to approach it in bullet fashion to make it very succinct points, and there are literally 14 points in that memo. So, first of all, the question, whether this board has jurisdiction over complaints alleging violations of the city's ethics code, which alleged violations occurred after the code was adopted, but prior to the board's existence. Does that potential situation exist? The answer is yes, potentially. Next bullet. This board was created by the passage of a charter amendment voted on November 4th, 2014. Third point, even though the amendment itself did not provide an effective date, the city charter incorporates the charter amendment and declares that it is amended as of 11/14/2014. So there's a 10-day window there where I believe certain procedural hoops were jumped through, whether the city had to publish it as a legal advertisement in the newspaper or whether they had to do something with the municipal code in order to publish it. I'm not sure of the minutia. But in my judgment, therefore, this board came into existence on November 14th, 2014. And all of you may want to make a mental note of that because I think it's critical. That's when your authority was created, I believe. Unlike the board, the code was actually adopted before the charter amendment. You may recall the City Commission adopted an ethics code on September 22nd, 2014. Okay. That's important. So there's about a 7-week window where we have an ethics code but no ethics board yet. So your question, which is a hypothetical question, because I understand there are no current complaints that fall in that 7-week window. Okay. Sort of as an aside, my next bullet is that the City Commission has subsequently amended the Ethics Code 3 times since September 22nd, 2014. And the nature of those amendments aren't really critical right now. What is more important, though, is to summarize that there are 5 provisions in the City Code that either mandate or prohibit behavior and are the Ethics Code. And they are the crux of the potential violations for filing a complaint against any city official. The next question is, which of the sections could trigger complaints? The answer is sections 2.8, 2-8, 2-9, 2-10, 2-11, and 2-12. That limited ethics code, and I've stated ad nauseum that it is very limited, much to the frustration of the people in this room and elsewhere in the city, this board cannot give itself authority. We are subject to the City Commission putting more teeth into this ethics code. So right now there are 5 provisions, and by way of example, accepting gifts is not prohibited in the ethics code. It may be prohibited in the personnel policies. It may be prohibited by state law, and the State Ethics Commission can enforce it, but this board cannot, unfortunately. Excuse the editorial comment. So there are 5 sections where this could arise. Okay. Now, I guess, spoiler alert, I didn't actually answer the chair's question, because there's only a 7-week window where an offense might arise someday. As courts are wont to say, the issue is not ripe. This board has a very limited budget, and I'm not sure you want to go to the expense of answering the question in the unlikely event a complaint is filed now some 3 years later over something that might have happened in a 7-week window. I also don't recommend going to that expense for this reason. The answer may not be as simple as it would at first appear. When the first ethics code was adopted on September 22nd of 2014, the ethics officer had certain powers to investigate and address. Well, address is not a real strong term. It doesn't say enforce or convict or levy. So it's unclear what the ethics officer's authority is, but it's very possible during that 7-week window that whatever enforcement authority there was, it would be held by the ethics officer and not this board, okay? And secondly, even if this board, if it were to be determined that it had authority during that 7-week window, it raises significant constitutional questions. Ex post facto, I try to avoid legal terms, but obviously you can't retroactively prohibit behavior and enforce it upon people who were not on notice that it was prohibited when they performed the act. So it raises ex post facto legal questions, and it also raises certain due process questions. So giving you a legal answer would require a bit of legal work. I'm happy to do it, but that's my report.
Okay. Any questions of Mr. Currington?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I'm just a simple soldier, so the answer is there's no answer. I mean, I was looking for a yes or a no at the end. I didn't get either of those, so I was just hoping for clarification from someone who teaches at the FSU School of Law.
I think that...
Or is this a case study in how attorneys answer a yes or no question?
This is when we all wish we'd paid more attention as one else. Clearly, anything that happens, any complaint that comes to us about activity after November 14th, 2014 is within our jurisdiction such as it is.
Correct.
Anything that happened from November 4th to November 14th or from September 22nd, November 14th, until November 14th of 2014 is in question. And I think what Mr. Currington is saying, and a different way to say what he just said is, it may depend on the nature of the complaint and the nature of the activity. So you have things, you can get different answers if something happened before September, but it wasn't discovered until late in September or in October. There are a variety of things that might affect the specifics of the answer. And at this point, the question is, do we want to set him loose on, in terms of billable hours, on answering that question? So I think what he's trying to kindly say is, why don't you wait and ask me this question when it's worth the board paying for it, paying for the answer? So, but yes, you're right. There is not an answer for that period, a solid yes/no answer from September 22nd, 2014 until November 14th, 2014.
If I might, in my own defense, the good news is we've defined the window.
Which took some doing in and of itself. Questions of Mr. Currington? All right. That moves us to the draft of the MyView. Now, we all saw the MyView last month, and we heard from the Tallahassee Democrat that it was way too long, and they were, you know, if it got published, they would use their editorial discretion to cut it down to around 500 words, most likely. So we asked Julie to go back and cut it to 500 words so that it would be our document rather than their edited down version of our document. So hopefully we're in that 500 word view. So I will, y'all, boy does that sound southern, y'all have had it now for a few days, and I'll ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to go through it very quickly, and if there are no changes suggested, I think it is her intention to go ahead and submit it within the next probably 24 hours, since we were really wanting to get it in this week. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did do some significant editing to this document to reduce the size. I think the aspirational goal as articulated by the Democrat is 500 words or under. This one goes 531 words. So if the board has comments, I would hope those would be to strike language and not to add it, because for everything we strike, or for everything we add, we're going to have to strike something else. And so I tried to hit upon the highest points, things that the public should know. And I need to acknowledge Mr. Davis, who for several meetings exhorted the board to produce just such a document. So he gets the credit / blame for the document, and I think he actually penned the original. We did some work on it at the last meeting, and so I tried as best I could to inform the public as he wished about what the board's been doing and has accomplished since inception, since I think a lot of the public might not know. There's lots of comments and news about it, but they may not know all the work that's been done in this over 2-year period. And then I did want to also make sure that everyone knows how to contact me and how to call the ethics hotline, 891-8813. So the commission vote on the expansion of the board's authority over misuse of position occurs on January the 31st, 2018. I believe it is critical that this item be published post haste so that citizens can familiarize themselves with the board, its activities, and perhaps be encouraging that the recommendations of this board get followed by the commission. So with that, I'm happy to receive comments, but any comments I get will be incorporated, sent to the Democrat, and any changes or modifications aren't necessarily my fault because they will be edited by someone other than myself. And thank you all.
Okay, any comment? Mr. Davis.
I'd just like to say that I appreciate the draft and the work by Julie. I know that no one's going to be satisfied with these days with just about anything you do fully. Someone's going to think it's not in depth enough or whatever. We're limited by the number of words, obviously, but I think it's a good start for us to take an opportunity to just say to the public, we're working for you. We're here actively working over these last years, and here's some of the things that have been accomplished. And we can maybe do it again as time goes by.
Anyone else? I have to say, seeing the final document, I really like the idea of publicizing the ethics and fraud hotline a little bit, using this opportunity to, I don't want to say generate business, but to enhance awareness of our existence.
It's a priority for this year.
Okay. With that, are there any objections to the document as it sits? Second one, I've seen it. Okay, Mr. Grant moves that this is in final form, and Ms. Meadows-Keefe go ahead and roll it, and Mr. Smith seconds. And with that, all in favor say aye. Aye. And opposed, nay. And Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you are authorized.
Great.
The next item is the draft letter to city employees with a focus on what the State Ethics Commission calls RIPEs. Those are Form 1 and Form 6 filers and procurement employees, since not all procurement employees are necessarily Form 1 filers, primarily as it relates to gifts and their responsibilities for reporting, accepting, or refusing, or buying down gifts. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you are recognized.
The first thing I want to do is point out a typo in the first paragraph. I say $1,000 in any year. That's the last sentence. In the first paragraph, the limit's actually $10,000. So that item will get corrected. The board chair, and actually I guess the whole board, did task me to prepare this document for distribution to the appropriate city staff, to remind them what their responsibilities are and what's to be reported and the mechanics of doing the same. This document, upon approval of you all today, will get distributed tomorrow, and whoever misses it that's not there, they will get it. And it will be further explained by our August board chair tomorrow. So this basically goes over the different forms, where the forms get filed. It talks through different definitions, how gifts are valued. We talk about how it's filed quarterly, and the location where it's filed. It's not scintillating reading, but.
Mr. Holloman, you're recognized.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, I'm not encumbered by any institutional knowledge about this board, but I am encumbered by institutional knowledge from similar boards. And when I saw this, it raised some questions in my mind that I thought would be appropriate to address with the board. And I guess first is, it appears to me that this is a document that's being provided by the board that's giving legal advice to the recipients of the document. And it occurs to me further that that's not how it's done at the Elections Commission or the Ethics Commission. The board itself does not provide any kind of guidance documents. And I think the reason why they don't is that if we give them the wrong advice, or we make an error, and now they're before us, and we're having to now consider somebody who is under our jurisdiction, and we've given them bad advice, that puts us in a pretty pickle. And so that's my first concern. My second concern is that the document seems to be written in a way that says you may or may not be subject to this reporting requirement. And it seems to put the onus on the employee to figure out whether or not they are. And I would hope that the city could tell employees that are subject to the reporting requirement, you're subject to the reporting requirement, and not have this be in any way ambiguous about who and who is not subject to the reporting requirement. So those are my observations, and I just wanted to share them with the board.
Okay, we have, a couple comments. On your first point, we have taken the position that because the charter amendment allows us to give advice, basically, or to train and to promote this stuff. We wrote a letter to the city manager under that authority with the idea that we were promoting activities. I will tell you that the information in this is drawn in large measure, well, almost solely from Florida Commission on Ethics materials. So we have a fairly high level of confidence in the material. Because ethics training is required for a lot of people pursuant to state law, and now the training has to be delivered by people who are knowledgeable in ethics, there is a lot of this that goes on. The way the law is written, on your second point, And I agree with both of those, that they are dangers for us, but they are paths that we've kind of gone down trying to do our job as best we can, and the way the charter amendment is written. The way the state law is written, the burden is on the employee, particularly difficult. Form 1 filers, Form 6 filers, obviously elected officials, Form 1 filers, usually it has to do with your placement in the organization, but and it's something you can work out with your boss. I know the city's general counsel has spent time with employees helping them decipher that. Once you file, then you get an annual reminder. But particularly procurement employees, the law is written in a fairly broad way. It doesn't necessarily mean you're the person who signs the check or you're the person who authorizes the purchase. If you're a person who's influential in the purchase of more than $10,000 a year of goods and services, you can be a procurement employee. And that really is, in my view, to a certain extent, in the eye of the beholder. And so one of the things we are hoping to do with this is to encourage some people to go back and look at what they do on a day-to-day basis and raise questions with their general counsel and get some sage advice. And that's one of the things that I was preparing to say tomorrow, that if you're not sure, you need to, these are the things the law requires that you do if you're one of these people. If you're not sure if you're one of these people, you need to go and check. And in some cases, it may take a change in your job description. In other cases, it may mean that you just became somebody who has to live with all these gift restrictions if you're a procurement employee. I don't know how to get around the ambiguity that's inherent in the state statute. So I guess my view would be to go ahead and send this in the role of the board as trying to advise people on ethical matters and promote that. If there are members of the board who object to it, I'm certain, I'm not running over anybody here. If a majority of the board is concerned and doesn't want to send, then that's fine with me too. Mr. Holloman.
Just, I was looking at the charter, the charter that establishes the ethics board and the bylaws, and the language in both the charter and the bylaws is that it's to manage and coordinate training, okay? It's not necessarily to deliver the training, it's to manage and coordinate the training. And in my opinion, again, I don't have any institutional knowledge about this board, I'm just looking at this from my prior experience, is that I do see the value in a separation between the board and the training function in terms of who's providing the training.
That's me.
But, that's just my read.
Right. Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
I will say that part of my job description, you all on this board are my bosses. And part of how I'm measured, and one of the things that I'm supposed to do as part of my job is to provide ethics education, not necessarily always myself. I don't always deliver it myself. There are PowerPoint presentations and other methods the city's utilized to deliver the training. But I have taken the responsibility as part of my job for the vast majority of ethics training that goes on and ethics guidance. Also, a key consideration for having this board was that there would be a central point of contact for ethics matters. Of course, the city attorney's office is the one that delivers actual legal advice to the city. But one of the aims that the public wanted in this board was, again, kind of a central point of contact. If someone has a question, they're supposed to contact me, and I'm supposed to try to be the person that provides that steering and that guidance. So in terms of this particular document, it did really get lifted from the general counsel at the Ethics Commission. He produces an outline, and this basically came from him. And most of it's, I would say, pretty basic. And the citations are to decisions made by the Ethics Commission.
Questions? Comments?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, quick comment. I think it's a good initiative. I do share the concern, though, is you don't want to set people up with a document that they then end up coming in front of you because of. But I do understand the role in the training, which I think is critical, by the way. And if this is pretty much what the Florida Commission on Ethics understands and interprets this to be, and I am okay with it. I guess, are we looking at a precedent? Is this something we will continue to do in different memos, depending on the issues, or one time? What are your thoughts?
Well, this in part was in response to the repeated concerns that we've heard about the football tickets. And we know there are a couple people, and I don't know how far that type of activity may have gone. I will tell you, when Julie asked me if I would do this piece, if this were something that directly involved our jurisdiction, I would not do it. But because we are here doing the statutorily required training for the jurisdiction of the board, and I do this a fair amount with various government folks, a lot of local government elected officials. I'm pretty comfortable. I've spent enough time out at the commission. I actually did this training when I worked for the Senate, for the senators. I would be very concerned about me or any member of the board standing up and saying, and doing training specifically on the city's ethics ordinance and how it would be interpreted, because I think that's asking for trouble. But here, because it's training on somebody else's jurisdiction and somebody else's activities, and that training around the state is routinely delivered by people other than the Florida Commission on Ethics staff. They will come in and do some, but they can't obviously do all the statewide training. So there are a lot of general counsels for local governments that do the training. There are a lot of people outside of government work specifically, but who have some knowledge in this or who have dealt with ethics issues over the years who do that training. And there's a fair number of people who are considered to be knowledgeable. I think there, my level of comfort was much higher.
All right, I agree with you. I'm just kind of thinking through this. I do appreciate, though, I think it's good work, and I think that anytime you can explain things maybe in simpler language or provide explanation to things that are not easily explained sometimes, I think that's good. And I do think that it's a good role for this board, and so I do commend Julie and you, Mr. Chair, whoever put this together, because I think it's a good initiative. Overall, I do understand the concerns of some of the other members, but I do think overall it's probably a good initiative to do this. So thanks for that.
Mr. Currington.
Yes, a couple of points. I appreciate Mr. Holloman's concerns, and in fairness to him, I may take some of the blame, I don't know, but on January 14th of 2016, I wrote an opinion regarding this board's authority to give advisory opinions. And I've advised the board it does have such authority, for better or worse. We've got 6 lawyers, we may get 6 opinions. But I will say this, part of the thinking there, I went into things like the prophylactic effect versus the home rule powers, all those sort of things. Unless it's prohibited by law, then under home rule power, the citizens of Tallahassee can give this board the authority. I think they did. But having said that, I think it's also important to note the charter in one sense is a little schizophrenic in the sense that it's partly penal in nature and partly prophylactic. And historically, up to this point, we've been narrowly construing the penal provisions, as case law suggests, and that for remedial provisions, we've liberally construed them. And I think it is a clear policy question. I think this board can say as a matter of policy whether we should be advising people on ethical matters, and we can fly spec training and education and construe it broadly or narrowly, but we've been construing it broadly. And maybe it's time to revisit it,
Mr. Chairman, just a couple last things. One, I don't have any objection whatsoever to the content of this memo, just to be clear on that. Okay, that's not my issue. And second, Mr. Currington, I wasn't aware of your prior opinion. I would have talked to you directly about this if I was. I apologize for not.
No apology necessary. I wasn't looking for that.
That's all right. No, I mean, that would be the way I would like to do it otherwise, so,
I would love to discuss it with you.
okay.
Yeah, in the early days of the board, we quickly became aware that we were going to receive complaints, and we were worried about our jurisdiction being narrow, but we also said, do we want to be in the business of only receiving complaints after somebody's done something wrong? And we looked specifically at the State Commission on Ethics and saw that the majority of their published opinions are answers to requests for advice, basically, a request for an opinion. And we thought that that would be a more valuable way for us to move if people had concerns. Obviously, they're going to go to the General Counsel's office, but there are legitimate concerns. The General Counsel represents them for a particular reason, whereas we might be a neutral voice. That we wanted to set ourselves up for people to be able to come to us and say, this may be happening in my professional life with the city of Tallahassee. What do you think, board, about the ethics of it? That we would be in a position to be able to answer that. So we wanted, as a board, to be able to take those positions to avoid us always being on the penal side of the charter amendment.
That's our mission, too. We have that in our mission statement.
Right. I am very aware of your concern about giving legal advice. And because I've done a fair bit of ethics training, one of the things I always do is say, you know, I'm not here as your lawyer. This isn't legal advice. This is simply a summary of what's out there, you know, and then to the extent that people want to ask specific questions, go, you know, I'll take those questions, go back and research them for them, but where I can't actually give them advice on a specific set of facts or circumstances. But in this case, I think because of the repeated issue of tickets, which has been before this board 5 or 6 months in a row, we thought it was the way to get at it was to go at gifts and to talk to the people who would be most likely to be recipients of gifts and therefore most likely to stumble into hopefully inadvertent violations of the quarterly gift reporting requirement. So, with that, any other questions, comments? Well, I guess what I ought to do then is say that we ought to take a motion on this. Would anyone like to move that we go ahead and send this memo to those city employees who are likely to be affected by the state ethics laws?
I'll move that.
In a second. Ms. McNeil, I see your hand up. Okay, all in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No.
Nay.
Okay. Mr. Davis, I'd miss. Were you a yay or a nay?
I would say yay.
Yay. Okay, then we will send it out in the near future. Make it available tomorrow to those folks to whom it applies. Next item of business is number 8, the grand jury report from the fall of 2017. This was on the issue of the mayor and his staff using software that they purchased and the extent to which that software was used for city business versus for election activities. Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you want to give us the nickel tour, please?
It might only be worth a penny, I don't know. But this item appears on the agenda at the request of the board chair. And this was an item that came out after this board took a look at the use of that particular software. I think we looked at that perhaps back in August in an executive session and found no violation. And at the same time, there was a state attorney, a grand jury inquiry into the matter. And they released this document, a no true bill presentment. The board was provided this document, I think last month, and the board chair requested that it be placed on the agenda. We've also heard from some members of the public about wanting to have it discussed, and really the bottom line is the grand jury did not find allegations sufficient to prosecute on this issue related to the mayor. And the city was reimbursed for the funds for the software, and the practice was stopped. And there was only a very small percentage of emails sent that may have had some campaign-related purpose to them. So there were concerns about the folks that were working in the mayor's office utilizing the software, and that's why it's here before you today to discuss any potential actions, any remediation, any education this board may want to recommend to deal with this in the future.
I would specifically refer you to pages 9 and 10, where the grand jury finds that the software was used, and this is the first full paragraph on page 9, was used outside the scope of legitimate communication with constituents. But then they go on to talk about that involved 4 emails. One of them clearly was misuse of the software and related to political activities rather than city activities. The other 3 they question. They go on page 10 to say that there would be 2 staff people that might be involved, or that would be involved with those 1 to 4 emails. And then they proceed to say that that is less than a 4% error rate or misuse rate, misuse being my word, error rate being their term, of the email system. So I guess the question for this board, now obviously this has been to the grand jury. They looked at the potential criminal liability primarily of the mayor, but they also talked about staff. I don't believe there's been any follow-up on that, so that it appears to be a kind of a no harm, no foul situation. I guess the question for the board is whether they think that the 1 email that the grand jury found to have been sent that was not specifically city, clearly specifically not city business, is something that would raise an issue for this board where the board members felt like some action of the board was necessary to take. And for at least Mr. Davis and Ms. McNeil, you remember we had a shade meeting. I'm told not to call it a shade meeting, but a shade meeting very early on looking at this. And I know I was one of the people who expressed some concerns that you know, that I would have a hard time finding 1 email out of hundreds to be a violation that was worthy of sanction. Because it seems to me in that situation to be de minimis. I would find it hard pressed to go through any of my email accounts and not be able to find an email that should have been sent on a different account. But questions or comments, concerns concerning this report or anything the board should do as a result of the information in the report?
I have a comment.
Mr. Chair? Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, just again,
Mr. Holloman.
based on my lack of experience here, I'm just wondering what are the range of things we could even do?
Julie, do you have the sanctions, the ordinance? It would be in the
Yeah.
city ordinance. Or Mr. Currington, I don't have the ordinance in front of me.
I do.
I guess I'm more asking is what's talked about in this document cover it under our ethics code?
Well, the issue here is that it isn't a violation of, there are only 4 or 5 things in the ethics code, so it would not be a violation of the city ethics ordinance. But this would be, again, one of those situations where, like we did with the city manager, we could write a letter to say, you know, we've looked at this, and while it's not a violation, it appears to raise ethical issues in this way. That would be the turf that we're on. There is specifically a city ordinance that says what sanctions the board can issue for violations of the city ethics code, and we'll get you a copy of that.
I'm familiar with those.
Okay.
I was just trying to get a feel for, because I didn't think this fell within the ethics code, but I want to know what were the range of our options if it did not fall within the ethics code. That's really what
It doesn't. I think we've previously decided it does not fall within the ethics code because we now have actual hard data as opposed to our view of what's in, what's out, particularly on which emails were city business. We looked at a bunch of these, and Ms. Meadows-Keefe did a thorough review, and I think at one point we identified as many as 7 that might be questionable in some way or another, but I think the grand jury pretty much got it down to the 1. So, Mr. Grant, Dr. Grant.
Sure. Yeah, I focus in on the paragraph that you mentioned on page 9. It's pretty clear that the grand jury decided that it was used for purposes outside the scope of legitimate communication, and that leaders should not use governmental resources to fundraise. I think that is pretty clear to me. I understand this thing about sanctions and what have you, but we also have a precedent of letters that would highlight behavior that we think is not ethical, and thereby trying to promote behavior that is ethical. So I think that we should consider that pretty strongly.
Okay. Ms.
I
McNeil?
just had one comment about page 9, the end of that first paragraph. They did suggest that the City of Tallahassee empower somebody to oversee and report the spending of its elected officials, personal staffs who are not otherwise subject to internal audit review. Is that something that's
The city has been talking about audits of because right now the city auditor only audits city functions but not the city commission, and they've been talking about, and they're in the process of expanding their audit capacity to cover the elected officials. I think going back to what Mr. Grant was saying, if the board wanted to do something here, I guess what we would do is a letter to the staff of the elected officials.
That
Ms. Meadows-Keefe.
that could be something the board does. The other thing, and this kind of goes back to the concern that Mr. Wilcox brought up about the bylaw, but these individuals are employees, so kind of that bylaw we have would require that those employees be reported to their supervisor, who's the mayor, who's obviously we dealt with that issue. So aside from the letter, the process we would normally employ is if there's an employee that violates, that's reported to the supervisor, and now we've identified that there's a potential conflict there that we have to deal with. So those are kind of the 2 things I would think of.
Well, I would think if we wanted to send a letter like that, we would probably want to send it to the personal staffs of all of the elected officials and not just the 2 people who are named here, because it's those people who are most likely to be involved in both city business and campaign activities, which I would hope this run-of-the-mill city employees would not. So I guess that's the question, is do we assume that this has been thoroughly investigated on the criminal side, which is far above our pay grade, and let it go, or do we, as a board, feel a need to or desire to weigh in?
Mr. Chair, just another comment. As you know, we discussed this a number of months ago when it first came up, and one of the issues not addressed, I guess, by the grand jury, or maybe I missed it, was the admission by the mayor himself that he had made a mistake in the purchase of the software and then repaid the city. Is my recollection of that correct?
Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I don't remember all the details. Do you remember?
He did write a check for about $5,000 to cover that expense.
Which essentially was, he admitted, I made a mistake.
Well, I think the grand jury said that he may not have known. I think there was an open question about whether he even knew that these emails were being sent out using this account. So I think he owned responsibility for it due to his position, but I think the grand jury found factually that there's a question about whether he even knew it was going on. So I wouldn't necessarily construe that as an admission. I'd say it's more of him taking responsibility for the issue.
Because if I recall correctly, it's the somewhere around $4,000 to $5,000 that had been previously taken out of a campaign account, and then the last year of its renewal or whatever, it was taken out of city funds, and that was the mistake that he admitted or owned up to, correct?
I don't know to what extent, I don't recall to what extent he admitted anything, but he did, in an abundance of caution, let me say, without having words or documents in front of me, he did repay any amount that had been spent on the software from city funds. The grand jury report says that they didn't find any evidence that he knew that these emails were sent from this account, from using this software. He didn't know. So, but clearly, whichever staff sent it would have had to know what software they were using. So there's a linkage there, at least as to the one email that grand jury says is clearly fundraising.
I guess what I'm getting at is there are two issues. You know, part is what the grand jury talked about, the number of emails, but the second was the purchase or renting or whatever the heck you do with the software out of city funds. That was
the software, and I know because I read a lot of those emails that were generated, and the software was purchased to basically keep track of the different mailing lists that the mayor has. All of them deal with things like the longest table event and different initiatives his office has. Some people want to be emailed on the longest table. Other people aren't interested in that, but are interested in his advocacy for kids in the city of Tallahassee. So the purpose of this software is to be able to group different people on your mailing list to receive different emails. And so there were many different kinds of emails sent, all of which, to me, seemed like they were part of the office of the mayor. Where we got into that gray area was with, I think it was just one. So out of the volume, I mean, the software was purchased to communicate with constituents and citizens for the city of Tallahassee.
Dr. Grant?
all right. Okay, I understand that, but and I know when we discussed this, we said, okay, let's wait for because it's kicked to the sheriff's office, let's wait for the grand jury to come back and decide. In the interim, the mayor said, sorry, made a mistake, here's the money back. You know, I guess the question for the board is, are those issues that we want to either highlight, write letters about, or somehow decide about, or do we figure that's water under the bridge at this point?
I think that's exactly the issue. Does anybody have any strong feelings one way or the other? Again, I think based on the grand jury report, if we were to take an action, it would probably be in the nature of a letter to the staffs of, and you all can disagree with me, but a letter to the staffs of the elected officials urging them to separate their work for the city from any work that they do that is campaign or campaign fundraising related. Now, the grand jury report may have already highlighted that issue for them pretty well, since this is public information. But we certainly can weigh in if it is the will of the board.
One more comment before we get some other comments, I guess. And I understand what you're saying. It's just, you always go back to leadership, okay? And, you know, the person who is in charge is responsible for everything that his or her organization does. And so they ultimately bear responsibility whether or not the staff's misbehaved or whatever. So I understand certainly, you know, that the staffs, the people who did these things that were not quite right should certainly be admonished. But I think at some point you also need to aim something at the boss who is responsible for all that to say, hey, you know, take a better look at how your organization is running your staff so that they receive the right guidance and the right direction, those kinds of things. Anybody want to weigh in on that one, or you think I'm off base?
Well, I mean, I think the point there is, should those staff persons be getting their direction from us or from their boss? And that's a pretty legitimate issue.
All right, well, obviously I think they ought to get it from the boss, so.
I'm not seeing any comments. Do you want to make a motion, or do you want to let this one ride? I think this ball's kind of in your court, Mr. Grant, Dr. Grant. Colonel Grant.
Sure.
One of those.
Yeah, I make a motion that the board put together a letter that is addressed to both the employees and to the mayor, highlighting some of the things that we think are not appropriate behavior in our role as promoting ethical conduct among city government and city leadership.
Okay, question on this motion. Is this to the mayor and his employees, or to the elected officials and their employees?
I think we need to send it to the mayor.
Just the mayor?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and his folks? All right. Comments, questions? I have a motion. Do I have a second? Recognize Mr. Davis. I think we're on comments and questions.
I would just say that as I work for a law firm, and I appreciate from time to time getting comments from our general counsel about ethical obligations and duties and reminders, kind reminders, respectful reminders. Y'all don't forget. This is an ethical duty we have in practicing law in the state of Florida. I appreciate that. And I think if this were done, and I would second this when the time is appropriate, if it's done, obviously the grand jury has spoken, and no one's been outside the information here probably that works in the city government here. But I think a kindly reminder from the ethics board could be a helpful thing. I just, in my own sense, I would hope it would be worded very respectfully. This is just me serving on this board. I think you can underdo things or overdo things in anything, and that's where I would hope we'd have a healthy, respectful balance.
Okay.
In how we communicate. But I would second this motion.
Okay, Mr. Holloman.
I have a question that's more, I guess, jurisdictional, not about the merits of this issue, because when I'm looking at the ethics code in our charter and the section 214 that deals with penalties, it gives us our authority to do things. And basically, if there's a violation of the ethics codes, we can give an oral reprimand, a written letter of instruction, a corrective action, blah, 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 blah. I mean, is this what we're talking about? One of those things? It sounds to me like it's either a written reprimand or a written letter of instruction or or something. Are we invoking the jurisdiction of what's in our charter, even though we don't have a violation of the ethics code? Irrespective of the merits of whatever the issue is, I'm just curious about that issue.
Yeah, I don't think we can invoke the sanction ordinance since we don't have a violation of the ethics ordinance.
So, but my question though is, can we take an action that would be a sanction if we don't have a violation of the ethics code?
Well, this would be, I think, and I think this is in part what Mr. Davis was getting at, it would not be in the nature of a sanction, it would be in the nature of advice from the board, sitting afar looking at these issues. Again, this is what we did with the city manager, where we said, you know, we've had an opportunity to review all this information. It's not within our jurisdiction to sanction, but nonetheless, we feel compelled to speak on the issue. So it would be more in the nature of giving advice than a sanction.
Isn't the word admonition that we used last time?
I believe it is. Although I think that was probably a stronger letter than we would write in this particular situation.
And I concur with Mr. Davis. Language is important. Civility is important.
I've got a motion and a second. I would like to, before we close this out, I would like, if the maker of the motion would accept it, I'd like to amend it to send it to all of the motion relate to all of the elected officials and their staffs. As we move into campaign season, I fear that this is the kind of situation that could sneak up on any of them. I think probably the mayor and his staff are pretty acutely aware of it. It is the others that I would be more worried about sensitizing to the issue. So if we are going to do good with this, would you be willing to broaden your motion?
By that, you mean to the mayor and the city commission? I'd be fine with that.
Okay, Mr. Davis, you made the second. Are you okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, comments, questions, concerns, debate? Okay, I have a motion and a second that we would bring back, I'm going to rephrase it, we bring back a draft letter that we would vote on. We're not going to send it without people seeing it, and we'd have to take a final vote, and so you'd have another bite at the apple. But a draft letter for the board to consider at the next meeting to the elected officials and their key staff persons, not necessarily every OPS person in the office, but their key staff persons. I'll leave that to Ms. Meadows-Keefe to figure out. Concerning our advice that they carefully distinguish and separate their city activities from their political or campaign activities. Is that fair, Ms. Meadows-Keefe?
That is fair.
Mr. Davis?
To avoid
Mr.
any appearance of impropriety.
To avoid any appearance of
Or
impropriety. There
words
you go.
to that effect.
Yeah,
I
or
leave
to
that to my attorney friends to.
Or maybe we take some language straight out of this that to use government resources for personal or political purposes outside the scope of legitimate communication with constituents. I mean, there may be some phrases in here. Ms. Meadows-Keefe will wordsmith. Okay, that's the motion. All in favor say aye.
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 Opposed, no. All right, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you have an assignment for next meeting. We are now going to take a break until it's 5:30. Let's take a break until 5:50. For the folks. More or less on time, back in the saddle. We are on agenda item 10. You will remember when the City Commission had their public hearing or public meeting on our recommendations, primarily in terms of expanding our jurisdiction, the mayor came up with 6 proposals, and we had decided at a prior meeting that we would take a look at those proposals. I think each of us volunteered to take one of them. So we have, I think, we've covered a couple of them in prior meetings. We have a couple more, and to the extent that it would be my intent that to the extent that we think that any of them are ideas that we would want to pursue, that those would go into our next set of recommendations to the city concerning ethics matters, whether it is expanding our jurisdiction or the ordinance, city's ordinances or the city's policies. So, Ms. Meadows Keefe, who are we doing first?
And we did jump ahead, Mr.
I know, I skipped number 9.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'll come back.
On the Tallahassee Ethics Code updates, we had 3 that were outstanding from last month. Mr. Davis was delayed due to flights, and due to time, we deferred recommendation number 4 for Ms. McNeil and recommendation number 6 for Board Member Smith. So I've been advised that all board members with outstanding assignments are prepared to comment, and Mr. Davis did submit a memo in writing that the board has.
Okay, so we are looking at, this is the, whoops, you have in front of you the mayor's 6 proposals. It says Tallahassee Ethics Code Updates 2017.
4, 5, and 6.
And we are on, Mr. Davis has, I think, item 4?
No, that's me. 5.
I'm sorry, 5. I'll go in alphabetical order, or in alphabetical numeric. I'll go in alphabetical order. Mr. Davis, we're going to go to item 5. You volunteered to give us some advice and your thoughts on this issue that says all lobbyists and organizations that advocate before the City Commission without registering with the city's official lobbyist registry can be fined up to $1,000. First violation, $2,500. Second violation, and banned from lobbying before the city for 3 years for a third violation. You are recognized, Mr. Davis.
Well, I put together this memo just to kind of include some thoughts and some results of research, and I thought that in looking at that mayor's proposal, some of the language was a little bit gray and probably needed some definitions, but obviously the city charter includes a definition of lobbying, which I've referred to in this memorandum, also a definition of lobbyist, and that I thought was helpful. Usually, obviously, that's someone who's receiving payment for purposes of lobbying rather than just a citizen who's here trying to speak to a city commissioner or mayor or whatever. Of course, the definition of lobbying, too, under the city ordinance, defines lobbying to mean communications outside a duly noticed public meeting. So I would understand that to mean that if you're speaking before the city commission in a noticed meeting, a public meeting, then that's not going to fall within the definition of lobbying. When I was talking to Julie about this project, we were trying to struggle with the idea of what about a executive director, for example, of a nonprofit organization who wants to come down and talk to a city commissioner about an issue. Let's say they want a road repaved in front of their offices or something like that. And I talked to a lobbyist friend of mine and studied some provisions from the State Ethics Commission and asked them for some help. I couldn't find any ethics decision right on point. As the lobbyist friend told me, sometimes the definitions and meanings when it comes to defining lobbyist and lobbying is clear as mud, even after his 30-plus years of lobbying in state government. But it just seems to me, as best I can tell from all the definitions, if you were a executive director of ECHO, for example, and you're down here trying to talk with a city commissioner about a road in front of your building or something like that and bear influence on them, that you're carrying out your normal duties as executive director of a nonprofit. You're not being paid for the principal purpose of lobbying. As best I can read opinions by the State Ethics Commission and definitions, that person would not likely have to register as a lobbyist and would not fall within the category of a lobbyist. I know there's a state Florida Administrative Code provision that keys into Chapter 112 that defines a lobbyist as one who is employed and receives payment or contracts for economic consideration for the purpose of lobbying, or a person who is principally employed for governmental affairs by another person or governmental entity to lobby an agency. And then it goes on to say, an employee of a principal is not a lobbyist unless the employee is principally employed for governmental affairs. Principally employed for governmental affairs means that one of the principal or most significant responsibilities of the employee to the employer is overseeing the employer's various relationships with government or representing the employer in its contacts with government. So I know that, as Julie was saying, none of us would want to see a citizen discouraged from having the freedom and access to city government to come and speak with folks as they saw fit. But I think when you look at this proposal that you asked me to evaluate and you plug in the definitions of lobbying and lobbyist, it probably shapes up to be a provision that would need those definitions for it to be a reasonable and carefully worded proposed ethics code provision. But again, when it says all lobbyists and organizations that advocate before this body, to me that's gray, because does that mean in a public meeting? Does that mean privately, one-on-one with the commissioner or mayor? That kind of language would need to be cleared up to make it consistent with the city's definition of lobbying and lobbyists. I don't know if that's helpful or not. That the city ethics, the city ordinances include that section at the very end of my memo involving exemptions to describe persons who are not lobbyists and shall not be required to register as lobbyists, and that includes a person who comes down to speak to someone here to make purely factual information requests to a member of the city commission or a member of a decision-making body connected to the city with no intent to affect a decision or recommendation, or if the city commission or city commissioner or mayor initiates a request for someone to come and provide factual information to the city commission or city commissioner, that would not place that person in the realm of lobbying. Julie and I talked about, well, what if a person, obviously, what if a person labels themselves as a consultant, and then can they get around the requirements of the duties of registering as a lobbyist and complying with all of the laws relating to lobbying? And my take on that would be, regardless of how you want to label yourself, if you step into the role of lobbying as defined by the city ordinances and begin lobbying as defined by the city ordinances, and you're being paid for it, then you're probably going to need to register as a lobbyist and set forth your purpose and let the public know, and you're going to be violating the rules and provisions on lobbying if you don't register and try to shield yourself by a label of being a consultant. But that's my effort to try to help a little bit.
Okay, so this might be something that we could put on a future agenda when we start looking at making recommendations. I would want to be very careful that people who are not paid, so if somebody is just a citizen who wants to come talk about the road in front of their house, that's not lobbying because they're not being paid. If Citizens for Ethics Reform, who's a bunch of volunteers, that would not be lobbying because they, obviously there's no, as Dr. Jackson would say, there's no money there, so different situation. I think it is important that we also not do anything that would discourage communication of citizens. So this would relate to people who are paid, being paid to advocate, primarily to advocate a position.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so let's let's do this. I don't know that it's something we need to vote on, but Ms. Meadows-Keefe, how about if we just put this issue on whatever that future agenda is, and maybe betwixt now and then we can come up with some initial language. I don't know that it will have to be very long, as we carefully, as Mr. Davis points out, carefully define what lobbying and lobbyist is. And I'm also not sure that there might not be a window for lobbying. So if you come in and I come in as a citizen and have a meeting with a commissioner and find that the discussion wanders into another topic related to my job, for which I'm not registered to lobby, and I go register to lobby the next day, maybe I ought to have a get-out-of-jail-free card on that one, that we're not intentionally catching people who inadvertently do something. But if they don't register within a certain window or whatever, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, I think that one might be a little safeguard too, since these are, in my view, substantial fines. Okay.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Davis.
I'll say one final thing. When you look at some of the state Florida Administrative Code provisions that tie into Chapter 112, I think it's very helpful when you see some of those provisions that say this is what lobbying is. This is an example. In another section, this is what lobbying is not, or these kind of actions do not constitute lobbying. I appreciate that kind of guidance. Some of those provisions, some of them were narrowly tailored into people dealing with water districts, water management districts. But those were some good examples, I thought, of what lobbying was and was not, that perhaps could be an example to follow if we ever needed to.
Okay. We'll definitely take a look when we get to drafting. Ms. McNeil, I'm sorry. Mr. Currington.
If I might, I don't want to speak out of turn again, but I did have a question for Mr. Davis, I guess. You use an example of a not-for-profit. I don't think it was your intention, but I wanted to clarify. Whether it's a not-for-profit or for-profit, would that affect your definition of lobbyist?
That's a good point.
I mean, I think AT&T could lobby to get their road in front of their building paved just as much as Echo.
I think the area that I struggle with, and it's hard to find clarification within everything, if you're the executive director of a nonprofit group or a profitable group, a corporation for profit, and you simply come to meet with the city commission to bear some influence on an issue, you're not being paid principally as a lobbyist. You're just being paid your normal salary. Does that pull you into the category of being a lobbyist? And it just gets gray. It's difficult to define sometimes. When I look at published opinions by the Florida Ethics Code provision, they seem to give a lot more leeway, and this is just my interpretation, to nonprofit groups and groups where you're not even close to being paid to have the principal role of being an advocate for someone else as a lobbyist. But then you think about the president of Florida State. He's registered with the state of Florida as a lobbyist. Well, he's not, I wouldn't think he's being paid extra for his efforts to influence legislators. He's just being paid his normal salary. But for whatever reason, he's registered with the state of Florida as a lobbyist. So I don't know what the thinking is of the General Counsel's Office, for example, Florida State, as to why president of the college or the university would be registered as a lobbyist. But probably that's a safe route for someone like that who's so high profile, and a lot of influence is being attempted on certain budget items and other items of legislation that could affect the university. How is that different from the executive director of ECHO? It is hard for me to get hold of a distinction.
I can tell you, related to university presence, there are two conflicting ethics commission opinions back, 15 or 20 years ago, in advising an ex-legislator who'd gone off to be the president of a I forget, it was either a university or community college at the time. They said that you do not, because the law requires that they sit out for 2 years. They cannot lobby for 2 years. And they said if you come up to present before the legislature as part of your job as the president of the higher education institution, you are not lobbying because it's just a minor ancillary part of your job, and so that you can do that without having to sit out for 2 years. And then about 6 or 8 years later, they had a chance to look at basically the same issue again and said, no, if it is a violation, we're changing our mind, reversing our course and saying that you are banned for 2 years from lobbying, and even if it's a minor ancillary part of your job as the president. In this case, I remember the second one was a community college, that you just basically couldn't come to Tallahassee for 2 years as an ex-legislator. And that was not dealing with lobbying specifically, it was dealing with the 2-year ban on lobbying, but it does kind of address the lobbying issue. So even they have struggled with the issue. There was a period, I guess, in the early 2000s when we had a large number of ex-legislators going off to be agency heads and university, high-level university officials. So I'm sure it's something we'll get to struggle with again in the future. But I think the message here is you think there is some merit in this overall in terms of making sure that people who are supposed to register as long as it's in Mr. Currington's world, we give them adequate notice of that whether or not they're committing a violation.
Yes.
Okay. Ms. McNeil, on item 4, this is that all individuals who serve as mayor or on the city commission should have no official business ties with individuals or entities doing business of $5,000 or more per year with the city.
So I really didn't have a lot of thought on this. I believe that the disclosure that is currently in place through the city policy is adequate enough. So I think I'm kind of remaining neutral on this.
Okay. So this does not sound like one that we would necessarily want to pursue in terms of a recommendation from us. Now, I mean, obviously the mayor and the commission will do whatever they want to do. It also seemed to me that it had, since the commissioners all have businesses and potentially business investments in other businesses, that this creates a possibility of some unintentional conflicts. And Mr. Smith, on item 6, the Ethics Commission shall produce a process by which city employees can anonymously, and they like anonymous, or the mayor does, anonymously report a bullying campaign claim against an elected official.
Okay. I had 4 things that I wanted to address concerning that. The first being, how will bullying be defined? Will cyberbullying be included? And these were just questions that I think we would need to answer before we could initiate this type of process. I think the process would make sense, but there's some things to consider. And who will maintain the anonymous reporting module? How will this affect the accused as far as due process is concerned? How likely are, and number 3 would be, how likely are accusations to be substantiated if the accuser or the reporter is anonymous? Do we currently have anonymous reporting mechanisms? I do believe we do, but what are the pros and cons of those? Are they even effective? And number 4, what are the funding considerations to initiate said endeavor?
Okay.
Just to throw in, we at FAMU we deal with an anonymous reporting mechanism for hazing reports, and I've seen some issues with that. It's a little difficult to substantiate some of the claims. People are more, they can throw a lot of things against the wall, but if you can't really get an accuser and then people have the due process, we run into a lot of problems when someone does not have a right to confront their accuser. And also it's difficult to glean certain information that you would need if you can't get back or correspond with an individual after they make those reports. So that would be the only thing that I would be hesitant about as far as anonymous reporting. But if we could find a way to rectify that, or if we've seen that it's been successful in the other anonymous reporting that we have throughout the city, then I would like to get information from that before we proceed.
Okay. Can we ask Ms. Meadows-Keefe to do some follow-up on, particularly on anonymous reporting in the city and how that, in other areas, how that works and how get the reporting managed and handled?
I can definitely, obviously, report on our own process that we have, ethics and fraud hotline. I don't know how other similar complaints, such as whistleblowers, are handled. And I don't believe that this proposal would draw our board into doing this particular function. So I can find out how other reporting mechanisms function within the city and how effective they are, and report back.
Okay. I have a question.
Mr. Holloman.
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just kind of a help me get up to speed kind of question here, and the question has to do with how the difference between a sworn complaint and an anonymous complaint with respect to our jurisdiction and what we do.
Right now, our jurisdiction, it doesn't say. It just says complaints. So we have been accepting anonymous complaints, and probably the bulk of the complaints we've gotten over the existence of the board have been anonymous. I will tell you the City Commission, in looking at expanding our jurisdiction, is considering saying that we could only act on sworn complaints under that expansion of jurisdiction. But the other side of that is we early on took the position that anything that came before the board, whether it was in the form of a complaint or just information, if the board voted to pursue it, that we would be basically self-initiating a complaint. So we could conceivably get an anonymous complaint, bring it before the board looks at the information that is available and says we think, the board decides that we think it is a violation, and so the board would self-initiate a complaint, which it would then pursue. So that might, there might be cases where it starts as an anonymous complaint, but because of the board's own investigations in the serious matter, becomes basically the board swearing a complaint to itself, if you will, which all gets a little murky, and we haven't gone down that path yet, and we're going to have to plow that field when we get there.
And so all that is subject to some kind of possible change if this ordinance, the proposed ordinance, passes?
Right, right. We'll figure out how to get there. The board has not been willing at this point to say that there's anything that if it looks like a serious violation, an actual violation of the city's ethics ordinance, that the way in which it comes before the board, the way in the manner in which it is reported to us should be the deciding factor about whether or not we would take action, that it would be based on our investigation of whether there actually is a violation, and the manner of it coming to us, whether it's in public testimony, in a sworn or anonymous complaint, or in information just that Julie comes across in her day-to-day activities, that any of those things might result in something that could be evidence of and documented as a violation of the city's ethics ordinance. But again, we haven't had a lot of experience because there's been so little within our jurisdiction that we haven't seen a lot of violations. So as with many issues, we'll be developing policy as we're implementing it. Okay, so it looks like on the mayor's recommendations, I think we have 4 of the 6 that we will we'll bring back up in some form or fashion for further consideration when we get to that point that we are making another round of recommendations to the city concerning policies, ordinances, and charter potentially.
And I would, just in the way of future planning, because you know I like to do that, I would consider that you will have a slate of new commissioners in December of this year. So the board may want to consider the timing of recommendations for like January 2019, when you're going to have the brand-new batch of commissioners. We made substantial recommendations this last go-round, so it might be worth saving up and doing a substantial letter to all the new people in January 2019. That'd be my recommendation for that.
Okay. As I am wont to do, I skipped item 9, the update on the public records policy. Now, this was mentioned
Yeah.
up in the proposed judgment on the ethics officer report, but you have in front of you a memorandum from Lou Shelley, the city attorney, and Ms. Meadows-Keefe, if you want to walk us through.
Yeah, this is going to be a very quick item. And again, leadership's going to receive education on this tomorrow, but this has already, as you can see, been distributed to appointed officials, executive team, and to the leadership team. And this does address the texting issue and the retention of texts, how they're not going to use their personal devices or accounts for work-related communication, and stuff that is inadvertently forwarded or received on personal accounts, that it should be forwarded to an appropriate account so that it can get archived here. And this is just a reminder. I know we have one new board member, and a reminder to all of you that if for some reason you get a complaint or an inquiry related to your service here on the ethics board, such as what are you going to do about X, Y, or Z, that is something that you should forward to me at my email address, or easier is ethics@talgov.com, ethics@talgov.com. So that's your quick and easy solution to maintaining that as a public record, because it will then be hosted on one of our servers. So they are emphasizing that to commissioners as well, because a lot of times citizens will maybe send a Facebook message to a commissioner about a particular issue, and then they wonder, well, how am I supposed to get that into a searchable public database? And that's the recommended course of action for that. They're implementing progressive discipline for violations, and there's going to be additional training about new policies and the use of personal devices. And city leadership's actually going to take a close look at who should actually get city phones, and we may have a potential to have more people getting city phones should they need them. So the new features to maintain all of the texts on city devices will be effective by February of 2018. So that basically summarizes that. And again, everybody's going to be discussing that tomorrow.
Okay, and this is something we'll put on future agendas as this evolves. It's public records is an interesting issue in an operational world where everybody has their own multiple electronic devices of their own, and work and home and family life all seem to overlap. I would hate to think how, as a legislative employee, how many emails I sent concerning going to lunch, going to dinner, rescheduling a doctor's appointment because we just announced a committee meeting, whatever. On the other hand, I know that I probably have on my personal email account lots of emails from folks that I worked with that might or might not be work-related. Now they're all really old.
Do you need to forward them to me?
No, these would not be
okay.
related to the board. But drawing a hard line in there, I think, is going to be an interesting issue to watch. So we'll bring this back before everybody, since at least in state law, public records and public meetings are part of ethics.
Right.
As we do every month, I will ask if there are any items that the board members want to see on the next or a future agenda.
I have to say something, too.
Seeing none, Ms. Meadows-Keefe, you have a comment?
The board has traditionally done ethics education for itself in the month of March. And we will proceed with doing that in March if there are no objections to that. And our March meeting is the third Tuesday of the month, so I want to be able to say what that date is because I don't know. It does not coincide with spring break, which is earlier this year. So those of us with kids, it's Tuesday, March the 20th. So I would just ask board members if it's humanly possible that you don't be absent for that meeting. That's when our ethics education will occur. We don't take 4 hours, but we do typically spend about an hour, hour and a half going over things of interest, and we're required to do it as board members.
Okay. I'd already pretty much opened up for public comment. Any other public comment? Seeing none, our next meeting is Tuesday, February 20th, 2018, same bat time, same bat channel. And with that, any other comments, questions? We are adjourned.